friends. Welcome to Bright Green Futures, episode 19, Witchy Solarpunk, with author BrightFlame. I'm your host, Susan K. Quinn, and we're here to lift up stories about a more sustainable and just world and talk about the struggle to get there. Today, we're going to talk with BrightFlame, who I've been aware of through solarpunk circles for some time. But I've only recently read her Humans Speak with Trees story, Thank Geo, in the Solarpunk Creatures anthology, and I just finished her new Witchy Solarpunk novel, The Working, which we're going to discuss today. Hello, BrightFlame. Welcome to the pod.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for having me on and creating this very important podcast, important for the world.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, and it's so nice to meet you face-to-face, voice-to-voice, finally, after sort of being in each other's circles for a while. It's one of the great pleasures for me of the podcast, that I get to do that, invite people on, and then I get to know them a little better. So, and I'm excited for our listeners to learn more about you. So let me get to your biography first, and then we'll dive into your book, your new book that you've got up. So you've got quite the biography. There's an but by the way, with that new book, there's an absolutely gorgeous cover that people are going to have to check out. Go to the Substack to see the cover, or follow the links at the end and see this beautiful cover that captures the interweaving of the eco themes and the pagan spirituality of the novel just really well. So
I love the cover. I'm thrilled that the publisher put it together. We had Sleepy Fox Studio, Kelly York from there, create the cover and work with me to nail it.
That's so good to hear. And I mean, I love human art out there, supporting human artists, but also just, sometimes it's hit or miss when you have a publisher and you're not in control necessarily. And you definitely scored with that one. I think it just hits it out of the park. So, okay, let me read your bio so people know who you are, and then we will get into it. BrightFlame writes, teaches, and makes magic toward a just, regenerating world. Her debut novel, The Working, just came out, launching in July 2024. And here's the blurb. A modern coven must thwart a looming eco-cataclysm to find the key to the bright future we need. Which is such a great blurb. Her short fiction is featured in Solarpunk Creatures, Bioluminescent, and Solarpunk magazine. She's known for teaching in the worldwide pagan community, and she co-founded the Center for Sustainable Futures at Columbia University. She lives on Lenape territory with a human, a forest, a labyrinth, the fae, bees, turtles, fungi, rocks, and many other non-humans. I love that. I feel like that bio just gives folks a feel for what they can expect in your book. It's also very integrated, all your works, fiction, nonfiction, teaching, practicing. You even mention in the acknowledgments that a long ago ancestor, which is represented in one of the characters in the book, came to you in a vision and told you to write the book, which is so great. So let's start there. You do all kinds of cool things in this novel, but I'd love to hear about that vision, if you're willing to share. Did the idea for the book get delivered to you in the vision, or was it more like an encouragement to pursue the idea, or some idea that you already had that you were working on, or how did that go down?
Well, it came in many parts. Part one, students of mine, witchcraft students from early on, asked me to write a nonfiction book with my flavor of the craft. But I most enjoy fiction, and I don't usually pick up a nonfiction book. I love a novel I can sink my teeth into. So there was that. So I set myself the task of filling a void. There hadn't been many or any novels that had real witchcraft, the kind that I practice anyway, embedded. So in my head, it was kind of a book of shadows of some sort, or we call it a grimoire, um, that someone who is interested in witchcraft could pick up the novel and hopefully have an enjoyable read, but also decipher some of the ways that real witches work and learn from that. But meanwhile, one of my ancient foremothers came through and offered various teachings, um, and then eventually told me, and get these out to the world. And they kept showing me some book or novel or something like that. And I had goddesses that I worked with who also offered teaching. And while they weren't hounding me the way this particular foremother or a group of ancestors did. They would always affirm, yes, this would be good to get out to the world. Like some things that came through to me would be good to get out to the world. Other things, no, they're private. So those are just two threads of how the book came to be. And I'll mention here that in my tradition, many traditions, um, trance journeying is part of the way that we work. It's part of the way we access information. It's part of the way we connect with our guides and our ancestors and other realms and the gods. So trance journeying is a real thing, even as incorporated in my book.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to you describe that experience and that coming to deciding to create the work and manifest the work in the world so our people can access it, it really just sounds very resonant with what readers are going to find in the book itself, like how the characters work with their craft and just sort of the whole lore or world building, if you put it in fiction terms, of how this works or how people exist in this culture, religion, experience, how they are in the world. And I find that fascinating. And one of the things that we have talked about previously on the pod is the concept of the long body, which I don't know why it took me a minute to figure this out, but or connect it to what you're describing as an experience of like connecting with your ancestors, and it's sort of a larger scope too, because you have like the goddesses in there and other elements and things. But the concept of the long body, if you haven't heard of it before, is the idea that we exist in this moment in time in our body right now. And our long body is like our body still existed a few minutes ago, a few hours, a few years ago. And so that's the long body. And then you go back far enough, there are two other people that created your body. So it's a sense of embodiment, existing in a fourth dimension of time and back through generations and connecting to ancestors. And then you can go forward with it because you're, trying to be a good ancestor for your descendants. And so I think that that concept works really well with what you're describing, like just how the embodiment of your characters and people in real riches in real life experience the world. And we're going to talk about that more later because I'm super into the embodied part of this. But before that, we need to like tell our listeners a little bit more about what's going on with the book. So this book has so much going on at once. There are 5 witches, each with their own lives, trying to come together to form a cohesive coven, each of them coming into their witchy powers. And the reader, through that, is discovering all the details of how they practice their craft. There's a pipeline running through the property of one of them, threatening her beloved forest. So there's the eco themes coming in. But the climate is really like practically a character in the novel, showing up with lots of storms and other ways that I won't go into because I don't want to spoil things. But before we get to the magical aspects of the story, let's talk about the mundane part. So there's this fight against the pipeline, and these characters are just like living through the Anthropocene. There's a storm, a flood, a power outage, all the things that we like are just becoming part of normal life now. And while the witches are all certainly like earth connected through their craft, they're also just like five women with jobs and lives and not necessarily eco activists, at least to start out with. So tell me more about how you decided these five women, these characters, were the witches that you wanted to tell your story through.
Whoa, that's a lot. That's a lot there. Shall I say they told me? That's one part of the answer. I always knew I would have five, probably women. So I'm writing in the world that I know. Um, it, be the part of this coven, or be the coven who I was writing about. In part five, because there's five elements in mine and many other spiritual practices. And also because they form a pentacle when they're working together, a five-pointed star. In earlier drafts of this novel, I had a lot of pentacle work incorporated, like how they would lie head to head and form a pentacle and run energy around. But that's actually not in the final version. So I knew there would be five, and I asked, who are you? Who um, wants to be part of this book? And I began to imagine or get these five very distinct women coming through. Um, I got to know them as one does when you especially write a long form story, and one that took years to write. I don't think I want to even tell you how many years ago I began writing this. So I got to know them really well, and they existed outside of me. And I would say, tell me your story, and tell me, the gist of the story that came early on was, okay, there would be some ancients who come through and tell this coven that we have a cataclysm ahead of us in our modern world, like right in front of us. And pardon me, I have to cough. um, and that maybe this group can help turn that around, find a way to fight it. But these ancestors wanted to speak with anyone they could reach in the future. So that was a kind of a premise. So I knew about, okay, looming cataclysm and something we all surely feel living in this world now, what we could face and in the very near future. Um, and by the way, one of my editing friends who helped me with very early drafts then told me how prescient I was because some of the things that are in those drafts are really what's up now. But anyway, I would say I didn't know the answer. I didn't know how do you fight all the ills of the world, the harm being done to the earth. How do you avert what's going to happen with this climate crisis, let alone the other social ills of the world. I didn't know the answer. So the book is the coven's struggle to find the answer along with the ancients. And I would ask them, I would ask my five main characters, now what? Tell me your story. So
That
they
is
would tell me they would tell me their own stories of their lives and their backstories. And now what do we do?
that is one of the brilliant parts of the like structure of how you've tackled this story, because that is the big question, right? Like, what do we do about this giant problem? And there's like each of us feels really small and that sort of thing. And here you've got five characters, and you do rotate through the five POVs, which is really nice to see. I'm like, I like seeing more of that out there where we're getting multiple points of view and it's not just like the lone hero. Like the coven really is an entity, like a collective that these women are forming and or trying to. And so that, yeah, they each have their own approaches and their own challenges. And I think that just like really grounds it, which is a term that is used a lot in the book, grounding. But like, I think that's something that's important for climate fiction in general, to ground into our lived experience through this, because we're all living through the Anthropocene and we all like struggle with those things. So that was really good to see. I like that. But you do actually have a ton of more spiritual and like fantasy elements. So I like how you mix the mundane and the spiritual, or as you call it, the astral plane. So like we literally have this almost like dual screen where we've got the mundane and the astral like side by side happening. And in the story and in the climate crisis, exists in both of those things, which is really interesting. And we spend a lot of time on that astral plane, which has a lot of power, both in the story and in the women's lives. But as a storyteller, I really like how you're able to work symbolically there. I think that's very cool. So tell me more about manifesting the climate crisis as both a literal thing that's happening in the real world and as a psychic thing that has its own power. So where did you draw the inspiration for the imagery that you use there?
Well, first of all, the astral is real for people in all different traditions. Though some, people view it different ways. We all have different schemas we put on the world, like whether it's a totally separate realm from the one we call the mundane world, or whether there's a big overlap or not. And even directionally, some people view it as I'm going down to the astral, and some up to the astral, and some just it's here, it's a step to the side. Um, but it is very real. And archetypes can exist or do exist on the astral. So there we get into symbolics a bit. But anything that's in what we call our consensed upon or not reality, the jointly held reality that we live in the so-called real world, right, has an aspect of it on the astral. So there are parts of and roots of the climate crisis on the astral. There's parts of and roots of all the things that harm the earth on the astral, um, and that harm the humans and the other beings of the earth are in the astral. Also, the astral is a place of energy and all possibility. So, really, anything can be created on the astral and influence this real world. So, there's that. Um, and the work that I have in the book that takes place on the astral um, really resonates with how we practice magical activism in my tradition. I don't want to give too much away of what the coven actually does on the astral, or what they see down there. But when you can, for instance, see what the roots of something look like on the astral, you have a better chance of working both energetically and just real mundane action to change that thing.
Yeah, no, it works on a lot of levels. Like, even if you're not pagan or believing in the literalness of something like the astral plane, there's just so many levels at which you can take it as an analogy and say, yeah, but we're all feeling this. What are we feeling? It's sort of a group, connection, a group ideology, all the stories that we tell each other about how things work and what the roots are of the problems that we have. that matters. That matters. I mean, that's a huge part of why I even started the pod, is saying we need better stories to tell us how, not even just how to solve the problem, but how to approach it, how to live through it, how to feel about it, how to feel about the roots of it, and what does that, give us in terms of direction for action. So all of that is storytelling, whether it's something that you believe is literally happening at a different plane of existence, or if it's, just happening in your mind or as a collective experience. Like there are a lot of ways to access it, but it is that I really like how you tied that together, and sort of like a very literal demonstration of the power of that other form of understanding. You know what I'm saying? And like, you just did a really great job in the book of that. And I think the readers will appreciate that as they go through. They don't need to know how the solution ends up to understand, to appreciate like the process of how all of that is working together. So,
Well,
and we,
thank you for representing that back to me. People can't see I'm shaking my head. Yes, yes, you got it.
well, and I expect that, different people are going to have different reactions, of course, to books. That's just how stories work. And I came into this book not knowing a lot about pagan practices, despite having a few friends who probably identify as witches. I just, have not really found myself, getting into the details of that. And when I was reading the book, I was like, I'm not really sure how much of this is real witch stuff and how much is like storytelling. Like it was very undefined for me when I was experiencing the book. And I think that's totally okay. So readers, when you're going into this, it's like totally okay to have that be your experience as you're reading the novel. And Bright Flame does at the end give you some insights. There's like a little acknowledgement section where you can read and be enlightened a little bit about what you just experienced. And I'm going to leave that for the reader to experience, because I think that's actually part of the process. But that being said, what this novel really feels like to me is eco-fiction fantasy, maybe even like urban fantasy, where it has that melding of real life and supernatural. But it's even more grounded than your normal urban fantasy, where you have like, vampires running the bar or something, in Seattle. Like there's that duality that urban fiction plays with, or urban fantasy, sorry, plays with a lot, where it's grounded in reality, but it also has this other layer, this supernatural layer. This is even more grounded because culturally it's real. Like witches are real, pagans are real. In the modern world, there is real discrimination. There is real bigotry against them, which we also see in the book. But I think that fantasy feel is great. And I think that will draw people in who might not normally think solar punk is what they're interested in, but they really love urban fantasy. So they might be like drawn in by that, and then they, end up reading a solar punk novel. Good for you. So, so was that intentional, that fantasy feel, or is that sort of just my interpretation of it, not being super knowledgeable about paganism from the outset?
It was intentional because I want my book to be not just speaking to witches, or eco activists. I wanted it to go out more mainstream, and I sure hope it will. That was part of what my ancestors said about, get the book out to the world, because I write to change the world in my own little way as best I can, um, and inspire others to do that. So I always knew it would be probably considered contemporary fantasy. Um, like you said, urban fantasy, that moniker invokes vampires and fake witches and werewolves and such, which my book is not at all. So I don't want people to pick it up and say, "Oh, this is an urban fantasy," uh, but uh, I I actually call it fabulous. There's not, you have to put down the codes of what genre your book falls in by these standardized codes, and there is not one for fabulism. There's one for magical realism, but that's really reserved for Latinx writers who are writing revolutionary works from their own lived experience. So I purposely have said to my publisher and others, I don't want to tag it as magical realism. Um, but fabulism is for those of us who are white and writing works that some might consider fantasy, but really it's real world with just some things exaggerated or twisted or, one or two fantastical elements. So I'm fine with it being called fantasy, contemporary fantasy. Matter of fact, I compare my book to N.K. Jemison's The City We Became, which has a very similar kind of a thing. Um, it's a diverse crew of people coming together to thwart this entity that's trying to take over, in this case, New York City. Um, and while her book isn't as much about climate, it's more about um, fighting capitalism and gentrification and white supremacy. My book has elements of that or is tangential to that, but it's more centered in, fighting the climate crisis.
Right. Which, I mean, we can say the climate crisis and capitalism are two separate things, but are they? No, not really. I mean,
No, no.
they're intimately connected, and one is the embodiment of the other, vice versa, or however, whichever directionality that goes. Um, but let's get back to that embodied. And by the way, I hope I didn't misspeak with saying it was urban fantasy. I think I'm not as super educated as you are about the terms of fabulous, for example. I wasn't super aware of that. But I looked at that and I said, oh, the people who like urban fantasy, I think they will like this. Even if it doesn't classify as that genre, I think the people who are into that kind of thing would cross over really easily. So hopefully it
That's
will pull
actually
in some
good to
people.
hear. Yeah.
Yeah. I think so. It just pings a lot of the same things that I think those readers enjoy. They want to have, higher stakes. They want to have supernatural stuff. They want to have a sense of a larger thing than just what our mundane lives are, as much as those are interesting. So, yeah, I think it really does ping on all those different levels for people. One of the great and very consistent parts of the story is this embodied way of knowing that pervades the witch's practices. So everything centers on the body, on grounding, connecting, reaching out from there. And it's not just mental, there's some very embodied physical actions that they take, like breathing and moving, even opening windows and clanging cowbells. And we talk a lot on the pod about renegotiating our relationship with nature and how that's going to be key to addressing climate change, and how there will need to be like different ways to access that for different folks. Different people are going to have different belief systems that they bring in, or just different ways of being in the world, because we're all coming from different cultures, different viewpoints. So for some, Indigenous perspectives about connecting to nature are super resonant, and they really connect with that. Right now, in fact, I'm co-writing a paper that talks about how science is giving us more information about our deep embodied connections to the biosphere. And that gives another access point for people that will work for some. That works for me, actually, in a big way. I really liked this recent book I've talked about on the pod called The Light Eaters, that really just puts some concrete details in how we are physically, literally connected to the world. And that opens it up for me. So tell me more about the embodied connection that paganism has to the earth and how that's a way to access a connection to nature for people who practice paganism, but even perhaps for those who do not.
Well, first of all, let me say I look forward to reading your essay. I'm working on something a little similar, and though maybe not bringing in the science that you're talking about, I love incorporating science into my work. Um, I also want to say I don't speak for all pagans. My tradition, the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft, um, is very much an embodied spiritual tradition. For me and many in my tradition, my whole body is my tool. My whole body is my way of sensing and shaping energy. Um, and often we'll take, as I said, trance journeys, but grounding is a very important practice where we are connecting with the energies of the earth, like physically connecting, and energies of the stars. And our energetic bodies extend out from our physical bodies, like way far out. Um, and not everybody can sense that, but it's how we have effect in the world, and it's how we interconnect with all the other living beings of the world. So, yes, anybody can work in a somatic or embodied way. Something I highly recommend. It's, first of all, just very healthy for our human bodies to work that way. And it opens up access to know and relate with Earth kin uh, in a big way. So I don't want to say all pagans work that way in an embodied practice, and there are different forms of ways of doing that. Um, and I I'm not indigenous, and I know many indigenous peoples live in an embodied way. They live interconnected with the earth in ways that have come down from ancestors for even millennia, close to the earth.
Yeah, I feel like the body is such a great portal for almost anyone because we all have bodies of various kinds and shapes and sizes and experiences in the world. But for the same reason that meditation and mindfulness is essentially an embodied experience, even though it's this weird thing where you're like, uh, it's a mindful thing. It even like it's in the word that it's in your mind, but in reality, it's like in your body. So it's like a tool that we all have. We all have that body sitting there, and that is the one of the ways that we can know stuff. And I feel like the stumbling block is very much what we're doing with our minds, like how to quiet that, what stories we tell ourselves, whether it's about our belief systems or about our practices or about our deep cultural understanding of how the world is. There's just a lot of different ways that we can access that, but it all kind of runs through the body. So that was just really interesting to me to sort of experience secondhand through the characters as they're living their practices, right? And what does that feel like? What does that look like? In a way, you're embodying that in the novel, right? Because you're showing us, and you go through it like a lot of times. That's so integral to what they're doing in the story that it becomes something that as a reader, you're like, okay, I kind of feel like I understand this in a way that if you had just told me what it was, I wouldn't necessarily have like gotten it. But because again, the power of fiction, right, is you've lived through it with these characters and in 5 different ways, because you got your 5 different characters and really sort of secondhand experienced it. And that's a really cool aspect. And something I think that people who are at all curious about paganism, your flavor of paganism, which I haven't really asked you, and maybe I should do that before we get to our final round because we got a tiny bit of time. You said that you have this reclaimed uh, tradition, and I don't know if I'm using the right words there, but like, what is specifically different about that tradition versus other traditions?
Well, we actually call it the reclaiming tradition, and there's all different stories. Like some of the founders, who include Starhawk, who many people know of, because she's written so many books, including The Spiral Dance, which is kind of a foundational book for people looking at ecstatic witchcraft and how to practice it. Um, it it's it, it's not but the reclaiming tradition is an ecstatic, ecofeminist, aspirationally anti-racist, anti-homophobic, transphobic, anti-ableist. We strive for all that stuff. Um, Tradition, and it's a non-hierarchical tradition as well, which is not common to all different pagan or even witchcraft traditions. So the reclaiming tradition is very experimental. Through the years that we step into mystery, we embrace mystery and let whatever comes through, messages, teachings, senses, feelings, guide us. We work with energy organically. Starhawk has this acronym she's written about, EIEIO, for what reclaiming practice means. It's what are the E's in that? Ensemble, ecstatic, inspirational. Um, it, um, the O is organic. Um, uh, I forget what some of the others are off the top of my head, but you all can look it up. Yeah. I even have that on my website,
Oh, I will look that up
brightflame.com,
and put
about
links in the show
reclaiming.
notes for people so they can see
Yeah.
it.
But yeah, we're just one little tradition. We're global. We are global, which I love because I get to interact with witches from all different continents. And we have what we call witch camps in many places around the globe. They're week-long intensives, um, which is a lot of ways we pass along teachings and rituals, and share magic together.
That sounds like a great constellation of um, ideologies or belief systems or approaches. I love that word ecstatic because it brings to mind things like mysticism, and there's even like a Catholic mysticism tradition. There's a tradition in naturalists where they have this sort of sense of awe of being in nature that kind of speaks to that sort of larger ecstatic experience. There's a whole thing now where people are very into psychedelics as a portal to that sort of mystical, ecstatic experience. So I think it speaks to a real fundamental part of how humans operate and seek. They seek out that experience in many different ways. So I think this will make people curious about your tradition and go look it up. We will definitely provide links for people if they want to learn more. All right, so I think we're getting close to the end. I want to make sure we leave time to go through our rapid round of 3 questions. So, first, what hopeful climate fiction have you read recently that you would recommend?
Um, I would definitely lift Different Kinds of Defiance by Hanan Bernardo. Um, I love that collection of stories. Uh, After climate catastrophe, for the most part, the various characters come together to find ways to keep on going, and creating new tech, interacting with the world they find themselves in to move forward. And in some cases, in some of the stories, to bring nature back the way we think of nature. So, and they all express radical hope, the kind of hope that creates together. So, yeah,
Yep, we
different
are big
kinds of
fans.
defiance.
Yes, we are big fans of Renan here on the pod, and I've had him on the pod, and he's a wonderful writer and a wonderful person, and I'm ecstatic, to use that word, that he is creating these stories, because he's just really very good at it, and we need more of that. So, okay, moving on. What do you do now? This question I should just throw away, because I mean, you just wrote an entire book about this question. So, but I'm gonna ask it anyway, just pro forma for the format of the pod. What do you do to stay grounded and hopeful in our precarious and fast changing world?
You're right. I did just write a book about that. So read The Working. I mean, really, it is about grounding. Um, in grounding, meaning sending our roots down into the earth below and relaxing into that delicious energy that's our birthright. It's the vitality that feeds us. Um, and it really helps us relax. It helps us shed stress. The earth's very generous in this way, that we could dump crap off of ourselves, like just slough it off, and the earth will transform it into just energy.
I,
So
I wanted
I
to
mean,
point out one aspect of the book, that this is not a spoiler, but just an aspect of that grounding process that recurred often in the book. Um, I liked how you had your witches experience things that they thought were grounding or empowering or whatever, but like actually not so much. And it was like, we can tell ourselves that this is helping, this is helping, this is helping, and like it's not. And sometimes our sisters have to call us out on that and say, like, no, this is actually not so much doing that. Just like evidence says, you look worse afterwards. Like, and I like that, because there's so much of what we do in the world that is a little script in our head that says, hey, this is what you do to relax. I'm going to go take a bubble bath, or I'm going to go, do XYZ, whatever the script says. And, is that really the thing that works for you? And the answer for you very clearly, very obviously is, your craft and your grounding, that you're literally doing this all the time. And
well,
I love
but
that.
wait, let me just put a big but in there. It's easier said than done, because I get depressed about the state of the world and just other things. And it's really hard to get yourself to do this when you're like down or have low energy, but that's the most important time to do it. And there's also like, there's a lot of things grounding, not just doing that exercise of like sending your roots or your cords down into the earth and connecting. I mean, taking a bubble bath, like you said, things that really relax and open you, even if you don't say I'm grounding, will ground you.
Yeah, and it can, and it's very personal, which is why I ask this question every time. And I get flavors of similar answers, but they're all still unique. And like, I use the bubble bath example because for me, that works. I love taking the bubble bath, and just that brings me just down 3 levels. But my husband, like, he would react the way a cat taking a bubble bath reacts. It would be like, I'm going to drown, get me out. So, like, it's the opposite of what I experience out of that exact same action. So, it is very personal. And, like you say, sometimes really hard to access, even if like, hey, if I go take a walk in the woods, I'm going to feel better, but just can't get my shoes on right now because I'm down and life is hard, or I just don't have time or access or whatever. So, we have to be gentle with ourselves. Readers, listeners, be
And
gentle with yourselves about
taking a,
this.
taking a walk in the woods is another really wonderful thing that I love to do when I get myself to do it. If I'm, you know, yeah, but it'll always break me out of a mood. It'll always lift me.
There's a lot of power there, even if you're not believing, the full pagan belief system. Just like there is power that everyone pretty much universally feels when they walk into a forest. It's speaks to us in a really elemental way. All right, so loved all this. Thank you so much for talking through all of your wonderful book. So tell us now, what's next for you? Are you working on another novel? Do you have any hints about that? You can tell us what it's about or what's going on.
Well, I have about a dozen Solarpunk stories, some of which have been published, that I've collected into what you might call a mosaic novel, a story collection that I'm trying to sell. So I'm pitching that. I love those stories, and since I wrote them way more recently than I wrote The Working, um, I in a way they're better written, I have to say. But they're really, I just love that world that I created, this solar punk future I created that all the stories take place in, but different times in that
Is this
future.
the threads thing that you were talking about,
Yes,
that the Think Geo story that's in Solarpunk Creatures that we talked about at the top of the pod, is that in that same story world?
yes, it is. The threads, I call that future society. And yeah, I have a lot of fun creating more and more stories in that future. So I'd love to get that out to the world. I'm also writing a nonfiction book on solarpunk witchcraft, something I've been um, creating my flavor of. It'll have a lot of experiential exercises incorporated because that's how I work. I taught a path at a recent witch camp on solar punk witchcraft, and it evolves as more people work with me on this. Um, so I want to get that book out to the world sooner than later. And then having just put the working out and tilting it even more into solar punk with the final editing that I did on it. I actually have a sequel that I'm playing with in my mind, but I have these other projects. I could see where a new novel would go with that coven and others from the story.
Well, yeah, and knowing how it ends, because I just finished reading it, I would be very interested in that sequel, because that would be squarely in a solar punk world that I would be very interested in. Plus, your nonfiction sounds like the perfect carry on from The Working as well, for people who would be curious about more, real world, not fiction, applications of things that they read about in the novel. So that sounds great. Sounds like you're doing some fabulous stuff. I will definitely make sure we get links to all that stuff so people can find you and find all your amazing work. And thank you for being on the pod today. It's been such a pleasure.
Well, same for me. Thank you so much for inviting me and for asking great questions. And I look forward to hearing people's responses.
Thank you to BrightFlame for joining us today. Definitely check out The Working's gorgeous cover and look for more cool stuff on her website. Links for everything can be found on the Substack, where you can also subscribe to get the bonus newsletters between podcast episodes. And make sure to enter the August giveaway going on right now. I'm giving away hopeful anthologies, notebooks, and a special solarpunk mug I designed myself. Bye for now. and remember to keep imagining the possibilities.